Hey everybody, Mr. Lynn here. It's day 5 of the quarantine. Coming to you from the couch in my living room. I just had a really interesting, long conversation with my brother-in-law, Ben Matus. My students have probably heard me reference him before. He has his undergraduate degree in bassoon performance from the Eastman School of Music. He has his master's in Baroque bassoon performance from Juilliard, and he is currently a professional performing musician in the New York City area, and he does some performances down through Washington, D.C. as well. So, being that his specialty is in historical music, I decided to have a conversation with him about a really a topic that's really interesting to me, and that's how musical instruments kind of evolved and changed into what we currently have as our modern band and orchestra instruments. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Enjoy.
All right. So, Mr. Matus, music
Hello.
history buff. I wanted to have a little conversation with you about the development of musical instruments and
Yeah,
kind of what leads to our modern orchestra. So,
absolutely.
if we were to start as early as we can,
Ooh,
early as we
let's come
possibly
back pretty
can,
far.
going back
Okay.
pretty far, we know they had musical instruments past just voice and percussion. Obviously, we know
Yeah.
that. What would be the earliest thing we have definite proof of?
Definite proof of we have instruments that resemble our recorders. Just a top blown flute with a little device to break the air and create sound waves. Those are the earliest real instruments we have. Yeah, and it wouldn't be much later until we get other things.
Okay, and we're guessing. Well, we have history of bone flutes, right? There,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
actually have artifacts of bone flutes.
Absolutely.
So we're guessing then eventually, depending on what materials were being made, and were obviously available, we'd start
Yeah.
to have the same things being made out of metal, wood, obviously bone, maybe even clay, right?
Yeah. There's tons of instruments made out of bone and horn, like the horns of various goats and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, quite a few of those instruments.
Very cool.
Yeah. So then,
go ahead.
oh no, I was just going to say that that the fingering systems for these recorders kind of developed into basically what we have for every single woodwind instrument. These just via scale, lifting one finger at a time, all the way down and up. Yeah.
Okay, so let's stick with the evolution of, since we're starting with woodwinds, right? The flute, a bone flute or recorder would be considered a woodwind, right? A whistle type instrument.
Absolutely.
Let's stick with that. Where would the evolution go from there?
So eventually, and we suspect a lot of these innovations were made in the Middle East. They started messing around with reeds that were growing just in the wild. The earliest ones we have that we have records of, none of the reeds themselves survived, but they're all double reeds. So by taking the two pieces of wood together and blowing through them, they're basically simulating the vocal folds of the voice.
Oh, interesting.
It's really just wooden duplicates of that. So by passing air through it.
Do you think that the examination of the vocal folds led to, do you think there was a link there, or they just kind of guessed?
It's entirely possible. There were certainly a lot of medical developments in that area that aren't necessarily as well understood nowadays. But I suspect mostly it was just people messing around and eventually finding something that worked. Yeah, it wouldn't be much longer until we get single-reeded instruments. But yeah, I imagine, just in the same way that you take a piece of grass and kind of blow through your finger. It's
classic.
Yeah, there was this sense of experimentation, and so basically you could take an instrument that really resembles a recorder and just stick a double reed on the top, and you get like predecessors of the oboe. These instruments that were a lot less sophisticated in timbre, a lot more aggressive sounding, but were really used for outdoor music, and occasional indoor. Yeah, there was definitely a lot happening in the Middle East with these instruments that then moved into Europe around the time of. We know for a fact that they were in Europe after the Crusades. It's likely that during the Crusades, Europeans took a lot of these instruments and adapted them. Same with the lute, which was one of the biggest, most popular instruments in Europe from the Middle Ages through the Baroque. It originated as the Arabic oud, and the actual wording is al-oud, meaning of the wood in Arabic, and they just dropped a couple letters here and there and turned it into lute. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So do we have any kind of guesses about what time period we started moving from the double reeds, the predecessors to the modern bassoon and oboe, English horn, going from that double reed to the single reed of, like, say, a clarinet?
Yeah, so the earliest European single-reeded instruments were the predecessors of the predecessor of the clarinet. It's called a chalumeau. It starts popping up in the Baroque period. There are some actually really fantastic concerti written for them by like Vivaldi. They pop up in his music quite a bit. We don't have any music by Bach that I'm aware of that involves chalumeau. But it's basically, it looks really similar to a recorder again, in that it's just a straight tube with a cap at the top. There's certainly no key work on these at the time, except maybe a key up at the top, just for an extra ventilation to get another higher note. But yeah, these are still not really having any key work. And it's funny you mentioned the oboe and the bassoon. So as a bassoonist myself, I like to I like this little tidbit of info, in that the predecessors of the oboe and the bassoon, respectively, the shawm and the dulcian. The dulcian grew out of the shawm in that people started making these instruments of all different sizes, similar to how a saxophone comes in all these different sizes. So we had shawms that were, like this big, basically, down to ones that were like 8 feet tall.
Wow.
The problem with those 8 feet tall ones is that it's a single piece of wood that is very hard to carry around with you. And,
Sure.
Musicians are the same as today as they were back then, in that you had to travel for gigs. So they had this brilliant idea, originally actually between going from trumpets into trombones, but of wrapping the tubing around. So instead of having this 8-foot tube going straight from the ceiling to the floor, you have a 4-foot tube that wraps back on itself. That innovation was, we believe, made with originally these instruments called slide trumpets, which were actually a pretty dangerous instrument to play, in that you have basically just a straight tube out in front of you, and you're sliding it in and away from your face. And I know quite a few people that play it, and there's a real serious danger of chipping your teeth when you bring it in too fast.
Sure. Any trombone player who's been a little too overzealous and brought that slide in too quick can tell you how much that hurts.
Yeah. So the brilliance of the trombone at the time was that, so you wrap it around on itself, so you only have to slide half as far to move to different positions. So you're not quite moving quite as far to shift your positions. So that innovation of wrapping the tubing back on itself translated into woodwinds, and to having a curved bore, which would then develop into the bassoon, and that idea would also translate to your modern day saxophones, bass clarinets, things like that. Any idea of wrapping back on oneself? Yeah.
So what about in the world of flutes? Right. So we know we have like that whistle style mouthpiece going all the way back historically and carrying all the way up into the folk instruments that I love to play, that penny whistle.
Yeah.
What do you think was the cause to shift from that whistle mouthpiece to that open hole tone hole mouthpiece?
So the shift to what's often called the cross-blown flute happened. They existed in the Middle Ages towards the end, as far as I know, and into the Renaissance. They became quite a popular instrument. The biggest advantage of them is dynamic control. So with a recorder, it's either you're making sound or you're not. If you mess around with your air support with that to try and make softer or louder sounds, you're just altering the pitch, really.
Right, you're affecting that octave jump.
Yeah, or you'll maybe get a little bit flat or sharp before you make those breaks. But with a cross-blown flute, there's a lot of flexibility with your embouchure, and you can mess with your air support in ways that you can maintain pitch while also having dynamic flexibility. At the time, they were still quite quiet. Back then, they were certainly made out of wood, and their bores were shaped differently than they are nowadays.
Oh, interesting. So the modern flute is a very cylindrical bore.
Yeah.
You think that, or I guess you would.
So there were changes in the style of the bore. The modern day flute bore was developed by a man named Georg Böhm in the I want to say either early 19th century or very, very late 18th century. But so yeah, that bore system was developed much later. And of course, these instruments are made out of a different material altogether. Mm-hmm. They're still made out of wood at the time, which is going to be a little bit less bang for your buck sound-wise than a metal flute. But of course, metal being significantly more expensive at the time, it wasn't common. We do have some interesting flutes made out of various things. Again, we do have some ivory flutes.
Interesting.
Going back to those bone flutes. Frederick the Great, the leader of the ruler of Prussia, was a phenomenal flute player. And actually wrote quite a few. Yeah, he wrote quite a few pieces. He wrote a lot of chamber music led by the flute, and I believe a few symphonies.
Wow.
To be honest, they're not absolutely wonderful pieces, but he was a phenomenal flute player, and lots of flute music was written for him. But that instrument, so I believe, if I'm understanding correctly, the head joint of it is a straight cylinder with no tapering or expanding of the bore. But then for the body of the flute, it's a slight taper to getting smaller towards the end of the flute. So you have a much smaller opening than you do closer to the head joint. And so that affects your ability to blow into the upper octave a little bit easier.
Interesting.
And slightly more control, nuance with chromatic things, because of course, without keys on these woodwind instruments, you're doing what's called cross fingering almost exclusively. So it's easiest to demonstrate for like recorder fingerings. So say this is your G,
right?
For example, if you want, this is C then. So let's do. So you're doing C, D, E from the side. That's three down and 2 and 1. If you want E flat, you're going to have to do 1 and 3 down to get your E flat, and that applies across all of these woodwind instruments. Of anytime you want to get a flat, you skip a finger and then add the next one down, which creates some really interesting colors. the sound.
Mhm.
It makes the instrument less sonically or acoustically pure. So you're
Okay.
getting these like really clean sounding, really even sounding things in like your C majors, your G majors, your F majors. And then once you get some Ps with more sharps and flats, all of a sudden you start getting these little wonky notes here and there. The clearest example of that sort of thing would be the horn. So before we had valve horns, these natural horns are just straight tubes.
Mhm.
So a lot of times people would often be changing crooks constantly, so adding pipes of different lengths so that they could play like in F and then the next moment in D. It
So,
actually is a
so
bit of
you're referencing what is the predecessor to the modern French horn, right?
exactly, yeah. So nowadays the horn parts, they'll oftentimes say in what key they're playing, but the actual physical instrument isn't changing anymore.
Right.
Because these valves now on it or pistons on other instruments are changing the length of the tubing. But if they wanted to change the length of the tubing, they had to take apart the instrument and reassemble it with different pipes. But if they didn't have time to do that, nowadays a French horn player has their left hand on their pistons and their right hand is inside the bell. And they don't do a ton with that anymore. But back with a natural horn, which didn't have any pistons again, they're just holding it. They would shift their hand shapes and block the airflow in certain ways to sort of make false pitches
Right.
to get a full scale. And that created very, very noticeable shifts in tone. And in fact, even once the valve horn was invented, certain composers still preferred the natural horn because they loved the expressive ways in which they could use these tone shifts. A famous example of that would be Johannes Brahms, who famously loved the natural horn over the valve horn. And he wrote the horn trio for piano, violin, and horn, which was written for the death of his mother. He wrote that specifically with natural horn in mind to get these really specific color shifts in the tone for certain notes, which nowadays we value a very even, consistent tone throughout all keys and registers of the instrument.
Right.
So there's been a big shift in priorities there. But yeah.
Yeah. So talking brass, so we can guess probably the same thing. Somebody tried buzzing into like a recorder type instrument, right?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure of how exactly they got their start. They're certainly the most efficient instrument for making a large sound outside. And again, it's the same principle as the double reed, where instead of you're using your lips as your false vocal cords. Yeah, I don't know for sure when those started popping up. But yeah, they obviously had a massive place for, we think of all these movies of these, trumpets with banners hanging from them,
Sure.
which is absolutely historical. Like they absolutely were doing that.
Because we have some even like Roman artwork depicting brass instruments, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a ton of instruments from Roman era that have been since like been tried to emulate. Famously, Adolf Sax, the Belgian instrument maker who invented the saxophone, he also invented the saxotuba, which resembles the sousaphone that we all know from marching bands, but it's a little bit smaller. And he had in mind the Roman tuba, which tuba is actually Latin for trumpet.
Okay.
So it's a smaller instrument, but Sax built this instrument with the bell kind of wrapping around and shooting over the shoulder. But I suspect, I've never seen one in person, but I think the range is closer to trombone area, not the super low tuba sound.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, tell us about one of my favorite instruments, the serpentine.
Oh, the serpent?
Yeah, the serpent.
Yeah. So there's this really weird family of instruments that developed in Europe that are wooden, but yet are buzzed like brass instruments. So we have this. The two most notable cases of this are the cornetto and the serpent. So cornetto really looks just like a recorder, and the fingering system is identical to a recorder, but yet it has this tiny, tiny, tiny mouthpiece, smaller than a trumpet mouthpiece now, that allows it to have this. It's really quite an otherworldly sound. It sounds very similar to a voice in a lot of ways. It's a very hard instrument. There's a lot of people out there that sound very bad on it, even professionals. I won't say names, but it certainly happens. And in the same way that all of these instruments were coming in various sizes, like saxophone nowadays is. The same is true for this instrument in that there were larger forms, eventually getting down to what's called the serpent, which is called that because it snakes around like this. And there's quite a few really, really ornamental ones that actually they put serpent, like carved serpent heads on them and things like that. But it's a phenomenal sound. And I'll send some YouTube videos for good examples if you want. Yeah, it's a phenomenal sound of this sort of breathy, it's like a breathier euphonium in a way. It's certainly a quieter sound,
Sure.
it being made out of wood. And they were also wrapped in leather. So it's a wooden instrument that had a leather wrapping on the outside, partially to protect the wood from things like cracking and environmental things like constant fluctuations of cold and heat and also moisture from breath is terrible for wood. It's really quite awful. And then the serpent actually stuck around for a very long time, much longer than the cornetto, its higher cousin. It stuck around into the 19th century, and it also had its own developments, modern developments that have since also died out. Famously, the ophicleide, which really looks like a saxophone, but is buzzed with like sort of a trombone mouthpiece. It's a phenomenal instrument, and it pops up in a lot of romantic orchestral repertoire. Like Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique has a really big ophicleide part, which nowadays in orchestras is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's just given to trombones. It's such an incredible sound, also a little bit breathy, because obviously you're taking these brass tubes and a buzzing system which works best in a really pure tubing that doesn't have holes in it. And then when you add holes to it, it kind of makes it a little breathy. But it's a color that a lot of these composers were really in favor of. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, there's been a lot of instruments that have come and gone between early history and nowadays. Lots of really strange instruments. I, as a bassoonist, am fond of the idea of the sarrusophone, which
I'm not familiar with that.
It's similar to the ophicleide. It's this metal saxophone-looking instrument, but is actually a double-reeded instrument.
Oh, okay.
It's believed it was intended to be used outside. Marching bands didn't really exist in Europe in the same way that they do here, but they were marching with instruments, and it's likely that this sarrusophone was used as sort of a marching bassoon.
Okay.
Yeah, as a bassoonist, I certainly wasn't marching with a bassoon in high school.
I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, no, bad idea. Yeah, for everyone involved. But yeah, there's a lot of funny instruments that have come and gone. One other interesting thing so during the Romantic era, this is also when technology is booming. We're in the Industrial Revolution. There's all sorts of machines being built, and Strauss actually found out about this instrument, this not musical instrument, but rather scientific instrument. I believe it's pronounced the aerophore. Basically, little bellows and a tube that you would then put the tube down your throat, and it would inflate your lungs, so that you never had to stop playing. It's essentially a automated circular breathing.
So it's kind of turning you into a living bagpipe.
Yeah, exactly. It's a terrible idea.
Doesn't sound like a good idea.
I imagine there were deaths, because of course you're not necessarily getting oxygen. You're getting air, but it's questionable what you're getting. And also, it couldn't have been good for musical purposes. We know he used it for his Alpine Symphony, or at least he tried to. I don't know what the success was for that. But I mean, having a tube in your mouth is going to really affect how you're going to play your instrument.
Sure.
So that couldn't have been handy. Not to mention, I can't imagine having a tube in my throat and trying to do anything besides not gag.
Right. Sure.
But yeah, it was a really romantic notion at the time that we'll invent this way to have it so wind players would never have to breathe. We could have these sounds going at all times. Because wind instruments were really, really prized always. In particular, we know Stravinsky loved the wind the most. He said the abruptness of the beginning of the sound, as opposed to the strings that kind of have to kind of work the sound like the same way you warm up a gong. They have to kind of have an initial warm up for the sound. Winds can just bam, it's on. Right. Which Stravinsky really prized, and a lot of those composers in like the early modernist school really loved. Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk orchestral strings then.
Yeah.
Because orchestral strings have always been violin, viola, cello, bass with 4 strings, right?
No. So it's really interesting. So violins and violas and cellos are all in the same family, cello being short for violoncello. So these instruments are all in the same family, and they, for the most part, all were 4 strings. There were a lot of cellos that were 5 strings. So in addition to having your C, G, D, and A strings, you also have an E string up on the top too. Those instruments were a little bit less acoustically pure. The body had to be a little bit smaller to accommodate those higher frequencies, and so the lower register was a little bit less strong. But playing a 5-string is really going to help you if you're playing Bach's E-flat major cello suite. That is brutally hard on a 4-string cello, and it works really well on a 5-string. But the bass is actually from a separate family of instruments altogether. It's not in the violin family. It's in the family of these instruments called the viols, or the viola da gamba. These families, it was originally called the violone, and because a bass is actually tuned different than the other instruments. The other instruments are all tuned in fifths. Bass is tuned in fourths.
Right.
Which obviously you don't want to, when you have to spread your fingers this much to get to the next note, you don't want to have an extra note you have to like shift to get to. But that's actually a style style of tuning that comes from these other instruments. So these instruments, these viols or gambas, however you want to call them, were 6 or 7 string instruments for the most part. That
7
were, many of them were 7 strings. That were all played in the lap or on the legs like a cello. And in fact, that's what gamba means in Italian. It means leg. So it was the violin of the legs. But they came in all different sizes. Again, like your saxophone, from these tiny, tiny ones that are adorable, to these violones, which are the same size roughly as our basses or double basses nowadays. One other really fascinating thing about them is that they're fretted.
Okay.
So instead of just placing your string wherever you feel the note goes, you're setting your frets ahead of time, and
those frets would be
working
adjustable, not like our modern guitars where the frets are set. Like they were actually adjustable.
Yeah, so they're tied on using the same materials as the strings, which, by the way, they're not using metal strings. They're using gut strings. They're using the intestines of sheep, which, despite it not being vegan and that being an entirely different discussion altogether, they produce a very, very lovely sound when played well. They don't play as loudly, but a lot of strings currently nowadays are still gut strings, and they're wound then with metal on the outside. But there was a shift away from gut strings during World War I. Actually, this practice lasted that long. In World War I, there was a rationing on gut because gut was used to stitch wounds. So they had to save all of their gut for keeping people alive. And there was a lot of metal. They were using a lot of metal for the war, but there was a lot of metal in general. So these gut strings were on all their instruments: violin family, gamba family, and they were used for the strings themselves and also for the frets. And these viols are actually tuned similar to a guitar, where it's mostly in fourths with a third in the middle. So that can really mess up when you're just like going along playing your scales, and then you're like, oh, whoops, that's the string swap. Where's the third? Oops. But yeah, so the violone, the double bass, what became the double bass, is from a separate family of instruments that is largely out of fashion now. The only time you see these instruments in a modern orchestra, like a non-period instrument orchestra, is when you're seeing performances of like works by Bach, like when the Philadelphia Orchestra does like the Bach St. Matthew Passion or something like that. They'll have to hire someone to play viola da gamba because there are massive solos in those pieces that there is no modern equivalent to make those sounds.
Interesting.
Whereas we've made a few modern versions of period instruments, at least that were made in the last century, to actually, and also primarily for the purpose of playing Bach. Chief among those being the oboe d'amore, the oboe of love. That's what everyone thinks when they hear oboe. It's like, oh, love. But this instrument was a slightly bigger oboe. Again, like the saxophone, all of these instruments came in various sizes. And in fact, in the 18th century, there was and also in the 17th century as well, there was a lot of it's called oboe bands, and it would be oboes of various sizes, from your standard oboe size, like sort of like in a string quartet. Like think about that 4-part texture or 5-part texture, where there'd be at least 2 regular oboes, and then there would be what's called a taille, which is a French word, Taille, which they were talking about for strings and also for oboes, but it's just a big oboe, sort of like an English horn. But so then they would be taking the middle voices and then the bassoon on the bottom. And then that later developed ensemble-wise into what was called the harmonie. So in Vienna, one of the most important musical ensembles for the Habsburg court was the harmonie, which was a wind ensemble. This was your first band. It was a wind ensemble of oboes, clarinets, basset horns, which are like really big clarinets,
interesting.
with a bend in them. So you're playing it and it goes out, and then kind of the bell goes down like to your side.
Interesting.
And that's another historical instrument that we have modern copies of, because this ensemble received a lot of music written for it by Mozart. And so when Mozart writes music for your instrument, regardless of how barbaric it might seem to a modern orchestra, it's getting played. So basset horns, bassoons, horns, and I always had either a contrabassoon as the bottom voice, or it would very often have a double bass. So that ensemble became the wind ensemble that would then later develop into our bands. One fun fact about basses that I also forgot to mention is that the amount of strings on that was wildly inconsistent. So as I mentioned, a lot of these violones, the predecessor of the double bass, had 6 or 7 strings on them. But there were also bass players that advocated for very different stringings. One of the famous composers for double bass, Dragonetti, he was actually playing on and writing music for a 3-string bass. I don't know the tuning of it myself, but it only had 3 strings on it, which would have made some really, really impressive shifting to have to get all your notes. But in Vienna, they were in particular a fan of this Viennese tuning, which is basically all your 5, yes, I believe so, 5 strings would be tuned basically in a giant B flat major chord. Which is, I suspect, came from its role as playing in these harmony ensembles, where a lot of music's written in B flat. Like think of the Mozart Grand Partita in B flat, which is written for this type of ensemble. So this instrument would be then a giant B flat chord that you could just saw away at and make this really massive sound for really dramatic effects. To keep up with these really loud wind instruments. But yeah, let's see. I do think I've neglected the plucked string family of instruments.
That was where I was going to ask you to go next, because I mean, we know that it's very popular. There's a ton of different, even modern. We've still got the guitar, which we've mentioned a couple times. We also have the mandolin, which is going to be in the double string kind of style. But I know because I've seen your group, the Chivalrous Crickets, have played. What is that massive instrument that you had with you? What was it? Like 8 feet tall or something? 6?
Yeah, it's a lot of them are between 5 and 7 feet. So this instrument is called the fiorbo, or in Italian, it was also the chitarrone. But it's basically a bass lute. So lute was the most popular instrument in Europe for the longest time. This is before people were really having keyboards at home. So everybody is trained in music, regardless. If you have an education, you're learning music. In the Middle Ages, it was one of the 4 main subjects you studied, the quadrivium. The other three subjects were the trivium, which is also where we get the term trivial. If something is annoying and meaningless, you'd say it's trivial. But so music was one of the four main things you studied. So everyone is musically literate. And at home, your likely instrument in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance is the lute. Again, like you said with the mandolin, it's double strung. And in fact, just about every plucked string instrument was double strung at this time, including guitars in the Baroque. And it's mostly a volume issue. These instruments are quite quiet.
Sure.
So to make a bit more sounds,
because again,
double string it.
We're using gut string, right?
Yes, exactly. We're still using gut.
Modern.
Yeah. There are a couple instruments in the late Renaissance and the Baroque that are wire strung, but it's a very particular sound, like the cittern, which also is now a modern folk instrument in a lot of like British Isles folk music traditions. So that's wire string, but for the most part, we're sticking with gut string instruments. And so these, like I personally have a Renaissance lute that's 8 courses. So it's double strung except for the highest string. So it's a total of 15 strings. So it takes forever to tune. But yeah, so this instrument is the most popular instrument across Europe. Everyone plays it. And anyone who's like a professional musician at court in the Renaissance is playing lute. In fact, Galileo himself was a phenomenal lute player and came from a family of lute players. There's a ton of music written by his father, and I actually believe there is some music written by him, which is pretty incredible. Like when he was locked away in that tower, he was playing lute. So this is the most popular instrument. It has the most solo repertoire of any instrument, even to this day.
Wow.
Since we took it from the Middle East during the Crusades and brought it to Europe, its life in Europe from the Crusades in the 14th century up until it fell out of favor in the early classical period. That time period, it dominated. And so it has the largest solo repertoire of any instrument. And so when they wanted to have it in ensembles and have a bass sound, what they did is they just took this like gourd-shaped body of an instrument, made it bigger, and then had these bass strings run to a separate elongated, like a peg box that's further away than your close peg box for your top strings. So these strings are like 5 to 7 feet long, and they are you're getting like strings that are taking up this much space for plucking. So you have to spread and do tons of insane work that way. But also it meant you couldn't fret those strings. You wouldn't be able to reach. You'd have to like reach your hand around in front of the neck and fret those if you wanted to. So they didn't even bother building a neck wide enough to fret those. And so that meant that these bottom strings are tuned like a harp, where it's just stepwise. But these instruments were so popular and used in opera, used in music at court. Songs were written. So for a while, music was just written in many parts. Like think of your Renaissance polyphony. And then in the beginning of the Baroque, this group of guys, the Florentine Camerata, these group of composers decided, like around 1600, that they were done with this super thick texture of many voices going all together once. They wanted one voice with accompaniment as like the best way to declaim text. And so that was really voice and theorbo for the most part. And then that birthed opera. where you could have one single voice with accompaniment at a given time telling a story. The Florentine Camerata is also thought to be the birth of opera as well, with Jacopo Peri writing the first opera, as it were, on the Orpheus story. So these plucked instruments were everywhere. Everyone was playing them.
Very cool. All right. Well, that was a ton of information.
Yeah.
I hope we blew some students' minds today.
Yeah.
With a little bit of a history. So I know you're participating in quarantine as well as everyone else. But can you kind of take a couple minutes and tell my students like where you perform, some groups that you perform with, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So, obviously all of my gigs have been canceled. The music world is kind of freaking out about that. But so I'm based in New York City. It's where I did my master's, and I've stayed there since because there's tons of work there. So I play with a bunch of different groups in New York. Each week is sort of a different group. But one group I play with a ton is called New York Baroque Incorporated. So this is all people playing on reproductions, or in the case of a couple string players, authentic instruments from the Renaissance or Baroque eras and classical eras. So I myself have a collection of 4 bassoons, and that collection is only going to be growing. Where I've got a modern bassoon, I've got a copy of an instrument from 1790 that I use for classical and early Romantic repertoire. And then I've got a Baroque bassoon from around 1700. And then I have a Dulcian, like what I mentioned at the beginning with the sort of the Renaissance bassoon, each with fewer and fewer keys as you go back. One clear example of that is a modern bassoon has 9 keys for this one thumb, or 10 if you have a really fancy bassoon. And on my instrument I play most frequently, my Baroque 1700 bassoon, I have 3 keys and a hole, and that's it. So I play with like New York Baroque Incorporated a lot. When I'm doing the group I do most of my medieval music with is a group called Alchemy, Alkemie, and that's focusing on medieval music with occasional new music pieces written by composer friends of ours. I was supposed to be playing with Handel and Haydn Society in a couple weeks up in Boston, which is one of the oldest orchestras in the United States, from back when Haydn was the new music of the time. So performing on various instruments, also a little bit of singing as well. I'm getting a copy of a German bagpipes from like the 1500s, hopefully next month, supposing COVID-19 hasn't affected their construction. That I'll be using for Renaissance and late medieval music, as well as maybe some folk music on the side. As Andy mentioned, I do play in a folk band called the Chivalrous Crickets, which we're hopefully still doing a tour in the fall to the UK and Norway.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah, hopefully that still happens.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. And thanks. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.
What? You made it all the way to the end? Good for you. See you tomorrow.